Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. If you're in Los Angeles this afternoon, if you're on the East Coast this early evening, and if you're like Tony in England, good evening. And if you're like Giora in Israel, you shouldn't be awake. You should go to sleep immediately and just buy the book and read it. We're really lucky tonight. We have the Vice Dean of the USC Cinematic Arts School as our interlocutor, a world-recognized expert on documentary film, who himself is soon on his way to Israel, where he will be teaching and be a fellow. So rather than spend time on those sorts of introductions, let me just say that I really enjoyed this book as a person who works in litigation in Hollywood, as a person who's been a great lover and a person of great interest in Israel. This book is incredibly well written, notwithstanding the fact it's published by a university press and written by university professors. It's a very, very interesting study of the arc of the history of Hollywood and Israel and the influence of one upon the other. We start off with great drama, and we end up in the fractured period that perhaps we're in now, although described as resilience. I want to hear more about all of that. But I'll stop talking, turn it over to Michael, and let's thank you for doing this, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bert. So first, let me say welcome to our two guest authors. Tony Shaw is professor of contemporary history at the University of Hertfordshire, author of several books. Giora Goodman is senior lecturer at Connecticut College and the chair of the Department of Multidisciplinary Studies there. And this is the first book that they've co-authored. So let's jump right in. I enjoyed reading the book a lot, and there's a point at which you say that this is a book in which you explore a particular intersection. And it's not an intersection that one often finds when thinking about the history of cinema or American film. And that is the kind of the intersection of politics, war, diplomacy, and celebrity. Now that makes sense in the context of this book, but many of our listeners may not yet have read the book. So that weave of politics, war, diplomacy, and celebrity does sound familiar. With Israel, war, I'm afraid, seems to always be a part of that calculus. But the idea about this intersection or the kind of encounter between Hollywood and Israel, which has this 70-year plus history, is really the object of your study. It's chronological. It takes us through this journey, and it really tries to be nuanced, which I think any reader is going to appreciate, because many people think they know what that relationship is likely to be, but until you really take a closer look and you see the ebbs and flows and the different personalities, some very memorable personalities, in fact, who have been part of this story that's unfolded. Until you see that, you realize this scenario just demands some kind of deeper investigation. So I'd like to start out by asking you guys to talk about what it was that spurred the interest, that made you realize that you needed to write this book.
So the trigger for me was I was working on a different project in the archives in Los Angeles, film archives in 2014. And in 2014, the summer of 2014, you may recall, there was a war in Gaza, and there was a huge row in Hollywood over what Israel was doing in Gaza. And this row involved some really big names like Sylvester Stallone, Penelope Cruz, Javier Bardem, Mark Ruffalo, all arguing about what Israel was doing, whether it was right or wrong. Javier Bardem accused Israel effectively of genocide. And this traveled across the globe. I'm in Hollywood, I'm in the archives, the movie archives, and pretty much around that time, I'm looking in Gregory Peck's papers to do with an unrelated project, and I find a letter from Frank Sinatra to Gregory Peck from the mid-70s saying to Peck, hey, I'm going to hire an airliner. This is Frank Sinatra. I'm going to hire an airliner and I want to fill it with people and take them to Israel because I think Israel's a great place. And you're going to meet all the politicians. You're going to meet the prime minister. And I thought, whoa, a whole airliner of stars going over there. This is interesting. So I thought, well, okay, if there's a row in 2014, things are happening in the 1970s. Maybe we should sort of track back and look at the wider relationship. So that was my trigger, and then I'm more an expert in the archives in the US. I knew of Giora, who was an expert in the archives in Israel. Maybe Giora could say a little bit more about his expertise and what that brings to the book.
Well, for me, the project started with probably the most famous film to do with the Hollywood-Israel relationship, and that's Exodus. And in fact, it does start, Michael, you're into documentary filmmaking, and it did start from a project around a decade earlier. There was an idea for documentary film, which never matured, about how Exodus was made. And this was after the celebrations around Israel's 50th in 1998, in which there was some discussion of Exodus 2 at the time. And just a little more than a decade later, I was still left with some good research from the archives. And I said, let's turn this into a story one day. And then again, the Los Angeles connection, a conference came up of the Association of Israel Studies at UCLA. And I said to myself, well, UCLA, what kind of paper are you going to present there? And most of my work until then had focused on news media and propaganda and public diplomacy with news media, during the British Mandate and Israeli, but suddenly targeting American public opinion. And I thought, well, you're going to UCLA, you might as well do something which might be also relevant specifically to Hollywood, and let's do this Exodus story. And then, and I prepared this as a paper and an article, and then a common friend of both of us who put us together, knew what Tony was working on, and that's how our co-work began at the time.
So my question to you guys, since you're both historians, you're both people who enjoy digging into the archive, having done some of that myself, I know that occasionally there are these aha moments where you find something that is an actual, it makes your heart throb. You know, there's just, it's something amazing. Can you share, each of you, one of those moments when there was just something that you found was so unexpected that made you realize that this story that you were going to be telling was full of surprises?
So for me, it was not in the conventional archives, not in the paper archives, but finding a great YouTube clip from 1978 of a TV show on ABC celebrating Israel's 30th birthday. And the clip I found, essentially, this was a TV show that lasted, it's a variety TV show. It starred more than 30 of the biggest names in Hollywood and sport, and from TV, etc. And they're all coming together to celebrate Israel's 30th birthday. And the show culminates in Barbra Streisand, then the biggest singer in the world. She sings 3 of her great hits. And then she interviews Golda Meir, the former prime minister of Israel. And Golda Meir is stuttering, and she's clearly not, she's like a rabbit in the headlights. She's not used, or she gives the impression she's not used to being in the limelight. And so Barbra Streisand is trying to calm her down, and Golda Meir is even more that great grandmother of the Jewish Jewish nation. It's just a fantastic piece of TV. And I thought, wow, Israel is being celebrated like, I mean, Hollywood has never done with any other country. And this is what our research found, that no country like Israel has been celebrated in that way by Hollywood over, you know, the past century or more. And that was just a wonderful find for me.
Giora, did you have any moments of surprise and wonderment?
Well, I had quite a few, and they tended to be around the work in the Israeli archives. And I was surprised again and again to find just how much effort and care and thought had been put in by Israeli government officials, by Israeli IDF officers who are in the IDF's public relations unit, into bringing over to Israel's cause what is the global entertainment capital. And I think that so much of the work in the archives, and certainly in Israeli state archives, but also on the American side has been focused on diplomacy, classic diplomacy. It's focused on political and economic and military relations. And the whole interest in cultural relations is developing a lot in the last decade, 2 decades. And a lot of that has tended to focus on high culture. And I think that the popular culture is really coming into play. The entertainment value of Hollywood films, which allow combining serious matters with crowd-pulling plots. And this is something that the Israeli government, I think the most important statement, summing that up, comes after the Entebbe operation, when the Israeli government receives suggestions from something like nearly 20 Hollywood production companies. This was one of the wow moments that you'd expect 1, 2, 3, but so many, and like an auction. And then they say, okay, but we're not really experts in making films. So they turn to Ephraim Kishon, who is Israel's most celebrated filmmaker or writer at the time and director. And they ask him to go over some of the proposals and help them choose. They chose Warner Brothers, but that didn't come out in the end. And he says, and he explains, this is an internal document, he says, what is the value of having one of Hollywood's biggest action stars at the time? And he's discussing a few names. And he's saying that the person who is sitting at row 40 at the top has, the top of the cinema identifies with a positive figure who is an Israeli hero. That is the true reach of Hollywood and the interest of the Israeli government in using Hollywood to promote a more positive image of Israel. And not only in the United States, but internationally, of course, because of Hollywood's international reach.
Well, something that comes across very strongly in the book, which doesn't surprise people who pay attention to the entertainment industry, is that there's so many false starts. There's so many projects that never get off the ground, that don't get greenlit in the end. And I wonder, as researchers, how much does that give you pause? Because so many of the juiciest stories and anecdotes were things that seemed like they would have been interesting and maybe bizarre and possibly not, particularly successful with audiences or critics, but they just never get off the ground. And many of the others that you do describe, you say, well, it didn't really attract an audience. So, if you were coming at this strictly from the point of view of, let's tell the stories of the films that have been most successful in creating Hollywood's version of Israel and Israeli history, this is not that book. This book is tracing this dance. It's a very elaborate dance between people in one community and people in another. And it's hard to know who's scamming whom at times in the story. Truly, I mean, there's the folks from Hollywood and they're kind of spinning something, and the Israeli folks in one government after another, up and in and out, they're kind of spinning and trying to get control over projects. Then very often, after all is said and done, nothing materializes. So were you interested in the dance? Was that part of it?
For sure, absolutely. I mean, we did think about it. So we thought, quite a bit has been written about Exodus and other well-known movies, and we wanted to go beyond those. And the beauty of, I think, of digging into the archives and finding materials, let's say, and I'm going to leave Giora to say a bit about one particular project because he worked on that more than I did. But we found a project that Fred Zimmerman wanted to put together in the very early years of Israel's life. And Giora will say more about it, but we used these diaries which Zimmerman had when he'd gone over to the young Israel, and he wanted to put together a project. And so we thought, should we leave nothing? You're right, Michael. Nothing came of that project, but should we leave that in? Should we take it out? But actually, what doesn't get made, as you say, is just as important in many ways as what does get made, because, and Giora will say, I think, a bit more about this. It's fundamentally comes down to making money. I mean, there's obviously a big connection between between Jewish Hollywood and Israel, of course, and we're going to come on to this, I imagine. But fundamentally, Hollywood is about making a profit. And oftentimes, these ideas for making movies, Hollywood figured, no, that just won't go. The box office won't work with that one. I mean, Giora, do you want to say a bit more about Fred Zimmerman's project?
Well, in general, and as someone who has researched quite a lot, not only the news media, but particularly the not only propaganda, but censorship, I believe that you learn about how the news media, documentary, television, and feature films, anything in the media, how they present issues just as much as by what is left out of the final product, whether if it's a news article or film. And a lot that gets left out allows or helps us to understand why things were left in there. And what was left out, it can often be as important as what is put inside to understand the approach and also the effect. And in the case of Hollywood filmmaking, it's not like government censorship, which very straightforward governments try and influence and manipulate news and say what can be published and what not, or what should be filmed and what not. Here, indeed, Hollywood is there, or the important Hollywood studios make their living by making a profit. Or as one Jewish producer in the 1950s, who was a big supporter of Israel, told the Israeli consul at the time, Nathaniel Loh, who tried to convince him, perhaps you want to make a film about Israel. He said, I'm a Jew on Saturday, meaning that, I'm involved in philanthropy, I'll support Israel in many ways. But when I'm doing my work, of course, the allegiance is to the stockholders or anybody who's employing me in the studio. And so many projects simply did not convince producers, even those who were very big supporters of Israel, that they will be able to make money from them, that they will return the cost. This is a very high-risk industry, of course. And there, of course, together with the ideological devotion to Israel, there are also other opposing forces, political ones too. For example, the Arab boycott, which certainly from correspondence that we found, especially in the Israeli state archives, because the Israeli foreign ministry is trying to find anybody and any place where Israel has got a problem with Arab boycott. A few film projects don't come about, and the Israeli consuls in LA understand unofficially, sometimes through sources, that the studio was worried about Arab reactions. I'll give you one example, and that is a first film project about Eli Cohen, the famous Israeli spy in Syria, which finally became a series in Netflix 2 or 3 years ago with Sacha Baron Cohen. This idea was first mooted already in the late 1960s, but the studio involved, one of the big ones, pulled out, and the Israeli foreign ministry understood that it's worries about, and there's Arab pressures there involved. So you have counter political pressures, you have political pressures, and then finally, perhaps not getting a story that is good enough. Fred Zinnemann came over to Israel in even before the War of Independence was over. He spent what for him were fascinating 2 months. He had just made a film about the Jewish plight in Europe, and he brought a young writer with him, who then went on and wrote a few very successful scripts. Stuart Stern, but the script
Rebel Without a Cause.
And yeah, exactly. And but
That's
6 years.
Successful.
But 6 years earlier, the script that he produced, Fred Zinnemann didn't find it good enough, and they just didn't manage to make a film from it. And in the meantime, Fred Zinnemann went off and to make High Noon. So probably, that was an important film coming out there instead of what would have been a film about Israel's independence.
Well, that's interesting. Zinnemann and that film has so often been thought of as a kind of parable about American politics. High Noon. It was about the blacklist. It was about, holding to your beliefs, et cetera. I want to kind of turn to a slightly different topic, because I think one of the things that makes the book kind of fascinating is that I'm sure that, especially during these years when the Israeli government was looking for allies, one of the reasons that they must have been even more enamored of Hollywood was because the people who were planning or thinking about making projects were doing two things besides. And one of them was that they were donors. They were giving out of their own pockets. And so, relatively large amounts of money. And I would say in that first generation, Dory Sherry and earlier, L.B. Mayer, the Warner Brothers, these were folks who were probably going to have a harder time making films about Israel, but they certainly were going to fundraise for Israel. So you could never really, you didn't want to insult anybody. You wanted to be sure to be as cordial as you could be. And the other thing was that to be able to build the film industry in Israel would be partly about bringing productions into the state of Israel that is a recurring motif in your book, which is ways to try to bring the production crews to Israel in order to film on location, because that brings a lot of dollars with it. And it can also help to create a burgeoning film industry within the country. And I will say, as someone who's gone and paid a lot of attention to film schools in Israel, there's probably more film schools per square inch in that country, literally, than anywhere else I can think of. And yet it wasn't until the early 60s, that the first film school got started with the help, according to your book, with the help of some American, entertainment folks, Hollywood folks. So sometimes that was a mirage, wasn't it? Because this thought, well, they'll bring these, like Lawrence of Arabia. If you could somehow redo Lawrence of Arabia and shoot it in Israel, it would be a bonanza, right? Or Cleopatra or 10 Commandments, all those, but they're like mirages, aren't they? I mean, consistently, this will be the story that we're bringing, a cast of thousands, or maybe even better, we'll hire extras locally. We'll build, the economy, and we'll build your industry alongside of it. And a lot of that was was it bait and switch? I mean, what was that going on there?
Giora, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, first of all, mentioning the film schools in the early 1960s, that completes our High Noon reference, because, of course, it was Carl Foreman, who was another liberal supporter of Israel, who after High Noon went over to live in Britain because of the problem of the blacklist. And he did very well over there with the Guns of Navarone and other films. And then he comes over to Israel, does it voluntarily. And, there's no profit motive there. He just is interested in helping the country. Teddy Kollek is instrumental in bringing him over. And he holds a scriptwriter's course, how to write scripts in Israel in the early 1960s, a very important time in which Israeli film industry really starts making serious films, which are not just Zionist propaganda films, but about social issues in Israel. And the money from making films, plus his course, that goes to what it will be the first film school at Tel Aviv University, that then Norman Jewison later helps and supports when he's making Jesus Christ Superstar 6 years later. So you do have Hollywood people who are interested in helping Israel develop its film industry. And I think this strong connection continues to this day. But then again, to produce films in Israel, you have to have state support and government help. And it comes down again to, at the end, it all costs money. And certainly from the big Hollywood producer or company boss, chairman, who made more films, big films about Israel than any other, and that includes Exodus, and was behind them, was Arthur Krim. In the late 50s and 1960s, with his two associates, Youngstein and Benjamin, there was 3 New York lawyers who became big Hollywood producers. And Arthur Krim very much wants Israel to have Solomon and Sheba with Yul Brynner, but the Franco government in Spain are offering 2,000 soldiers for free, and the IDF won't do that. So in the end, filming goes to Spain because it will be cheaper there. But still, quite a few films made in Israel by United Artists, headed by Krim, Youngstein, and Robert Benjamin.
Then isn't it also true that by the time of Menachem Golem and then other Israelis who were becoming successful in Hollywood, then the movement goes back and forth, and so you've got Israelis becoming successful in Hollywood and then helping to kind of bring that success back home. And now, of course, for those of us who can fast forward sufficiently, you've got all of those television programs which have, like In Treatment, the pool being the basis for In Treatment, and Homeland and other kinds of very successful television programs in this country that were really created in Israel by Israeli talent that get exported. So it's very interesting to think about the flow, let's say, that goes back and forth between Hollywood and Israel. And it's, again, more nuanced than one might think. It doesn't always go in one direction. Can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can pick up on, you mentioned Menachem Golan, who becomes a really important filmmaker in Hollywood from the 80s onwards. He produces a lot of what people condemned as schlock and cheap, terrible films. But politically, I think he was quite interesting. If you look at the films that he makes, he's what I would call the sort of king of the terrorist movie in the 80s and 90s. He's producing a lot of movies which are very supportive of Israel, very anti-Arab, and people lap these movies up. They're not huge blockbusters, but they're successful in their own rights. Like a film like The Delta Force, for instance, which came out in the mid-80s. and is a sort of hijacking movie. Again, critics hated these movies. I think the public liked them quite a bit. So Golan, I think, acts as a sort of symbol for Israeli filmmakers to make it in the US. And then you're right, Michael, if we shoot forward 30, 40 years to the present day, someone like Gideon Raff, who is part of this brain drain from Israel to come to Hollywood and work in the American film industry. He's making a number of TV series like The Spy, for instance, which was just mentioned by Giora, which is about Eli Cohen, this spy of Israel's in Syria in the 60s. So not all, of course, of what Gideon Raff is producing is in any way necessarily pro-Israeli or propagandistic, but he's an indication of, and even someone like Gal Gadot, for instance, as an actress, you know, who's quite a symbol for, a useful symbol, I think, for Israel amongst the international audiences these days.
Yeah, I think that she's partly a symbol because it's a way of saying, you think Americans invented feminism, but look at this tall, strong woman with a military background. Israel's full of these people, and you know they're super women, and here's one of them, right? There's a moment in your book when you talk about, for those of us who can recall the Vanessa Redgrave moment from the Academy Awards, when she very publicly spoke out against Israeli aggression in her eyes. And so I want to think about that as another dimension of this relationship between Hollywood and Israel, because at the time, there was greater sympathy internationally for the Palestinian effort and for Arafat and the PLO, et cetera. And she was probably the most vocal and had the, you know, biggest platform for it. But the way that Hollywood responded, and when I say Hollywood, I don't know exactly, I mean, I kind of hate that word because it covers over more than it reveals. But there was such a response. There was so much support for Israel as a rebuttal to that moment, to Vanessa Redgrave. And it makes me think about how this, especially the Jewish Hollywood community, is sometimes doesn't take the initiative, won't be preemptive, but they will come to the defense when things are said. And that seems to have been one of those key moments in the late 1970s. And it also seems to be a watershed moment because it brings us much more up to date to the moment when so many of kind of young Hollywood are at the very least ambivalent about their feelings about Israel. And so could we talk a little bit about kind of that Redgrave moment on up and how the community in Hollywood has been responsive to the very strong critiques of the Israeli government?
Yeah, Giora might want to come in, but I would certainly want to talk a bit about the Redgrave moment, as you put it, in 1978. So she accuses those outside who have been excoriating her for having made a film called The Palestinian, which was very pro-Palestinian and condemned by many people as pro-terrorist. So she calls these people outside who are protesting Zionist hoodlums. And you know, she makes this speech, and there's a deathly silence briefly in the Oscars ceremony hall, and then afterwards at the party, when you know she's just won an Oscar, no one will speak to her, and even immediately afterwards, in fact, you know, she's condemned on the platform for using her film and the Oscars as propaganda. And we looked at this. We go into this in great detail and try and explore what the impact was on Redgrave's career, for instance. I mean, she went on to make a Holocaust film a few years afterwards, and there was further criticism of CBS choosing her to play a sort of Holocaust victim, which again, you know, added greater pressure to her. And we thought, well, did this affect Redgrave's career? And we found no evidence of that, though some people did argue that she was sort of semi-blacklisted. we didn't find any evidence of that. And she continued to be, and she continued now to be, very pro-Palestinian activist. And that moment, that Redgrave moment, I think is a sort of first crack, so to speak, in this relationship between Hollywood and Israel. And if we go through more to the present day, I don't know whether Giora wants to do this, and we can see greater ambivalence. And right through to the present day, we could talk about, for instance, BDS, the impact that has on Hollywood, and the different groupings there are in Hollywood at the moment. Giora, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, the response to Vanessa Redgrave in the late 1970s, and responding in the hall at the time, was Paddy Chayefsky. And I think that he represents a generation of Jewish creative artists working in the film industry, who, and some even more than him, hold liberal views in American domestic politics, and are big supporters of Israel. And that's Fred Zinnemann and Carl Foreman and Kirk Douglas, Otto Preminger. These are all people who see themselves as part of the liberal supporting, Democratic Party supporting, Arthur Krim I mentioned. These people are big supporters of Israel, as the American progressive forces were in the early years of Israeli statehood. And I think that the change begins after the Redgrave incident is in the late 1970s, is of course very much a Hollywood, an Oscar night incident. But then in the 1980s, with the first Lebanon War, and then the first Intifada, and the moral doubts about Israel's use of force and the direction of its government. Until then, these were Labour Party governments who always cared about speaking about peace, even when they went to war, such as in 1967. And then you have right-wing governments. And I think that slowly Hollywood reflects something that has happened, I think, also with in the United States, but also the American Jewish community. And that is the younger liberals, they are more ambivalent about Israel, while the old generation, such as Kirk Douglas, would support Israel and continued support of Israel and defend its during the invasion of Lebanon. People like Kirk Douglas, even Jane Fonda at the time, offer support to Israel, and in the last decade, we see something different, and that is the increasing moral doubts about Israel, which don't necessarily come with being anti-Israel. Natalie Portman certainly is somebody who's very, very greatly attached to Israel and a country and a state where she was born, but with a lot of criticism about the direction of Israeli governments. And that is that is the ambivalence, Michael, that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, it becomes, and it made me wonder in reading the book. It seemed that the first decades, the kind of the moral trajectory seemed relatively clear, and the moral trajectory post, let's say, first Lebanon War and the first Intifada becomes increasingly murky, and it's much harder to see how Hollywood is a kind of entity in any kind of meaningful way. It seems way more kind of fractured in terms of responses. There's still probably an unwillingness to be outspoken as a critic, maybe, but it's harder to find people just lining up for support no matter what, right? So maybe we should say a little something about this moment of the BDS, the boycott and sanctions against Israel and Israeli culture, and also the growing signs of anti-Semitism, because the Anti-Defamation League here in this country has come out with some data quite recently about the uptick in anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist activity in this country. And it's a kind of dramatic upsurge. And it does bring back this question about this relationship, this very important relationship between the Hollywood film industry on the one hand and Israel and the state on the other, and how the temperature has risen around people deciding and being willing or having the kind of the courage to speak out in favor. And I can say, as someone who's on a college campus, that there are many of our college students in the United States now who find themselves feeling really levels of discomfort that to me seem unprecedented. If they come out in favor of, if they are seen in any way to be pro-Israeli or a Zionist, it becomes a much more difficult stance to occupy in the American Academy at this moment. And I know in Britain, it's even a harsher situation. At least that's my understanding. So I wonder, and I think maybe our audience might be very interested to kind of hear your take on how this moment with BDS and sanctions and the moral opprobrium that's being spread around, how this plays out in your thinking about your book. Can your book make an intervention by historicizing this? Can it help us understand better what's going on right now?
I think I would say to that, Michael, is that, you know, looking at the row where we started, looking at the 2014 row over the Gaza war, for instance, and tracking from that point onwards, I think there are several groupings in Hollywood going from this is simplifying here, but it helps for the purpose of this event. You know, if you're looking at from those on political right, let's say the Sylvester Stallones, the Arnold Schwarzeneggers, who are very supportive of the IDF. And then you've got people like, say, in the center ground, like, let's say Michael Douglas, or calling himself a liberal, again, supportive of the IDF, or supportive of Israel, concerns perhaps about the IDF, but carrying the torch of what his father was like, Kirk. And yet someone like Natalie Portman, who Giora mentioned, for instance, Michael Douglas was given what's called the Genesis Prize at the Jewish Nobel. He was given, let's say, 7 or 8 years ago. He was very willing to accept that and to use the prize as a way of bringing together Jews and non-Jews. Well, Natalie Portman, a few years later, she was offered it, but she refused to go to Israel to accept it because Netanyahu was going to be the ceremony. This was seen to some extent as treachery on the part of her. And I think she is a lightning rod, and has been a lightning rod for these changes, this potential opposition that there is to the shift to the right. And then you get some people with the BDS movement. I mean, I think there's a relatively small number of well-known celebrities in Hollywood who've been pro-BDS. You might have Viggo Mortensen and Danny Glover, but for the most part, most are reluctant to go that far, I think, in actively supporting BDS. And this is why I think, maybe you mentioned at the outset, I think the Hollywood relationship with Israel is really quite resilient still. In other words, in its substructure, there's still a significant attachment within these different wings of Hollywood towards Israel and what Israel represents.
I think that the BDS is a much bigger challenge for the supporters of Israel. And this is again from hearing descriptions of what is happening on US or campuses in academia, or coming across various activities as they're described in the media, because of course where I live in the Upper Galilee, in a rural area, so BDS has a very small effect. But then again, the idea of BDS is not only around culture, but it's around economic pressure. And here Israel itself has proved resilient. And it is around cultural events that it has been possible for the BDS movement to put pressure on especially young Israelis who in the last decade have had much less international rock groups and stars coming over and playing concerts here. And many of them probably, because it won't say we won't appear in Israel because of BDS, but just the moment we announce we'll appear in Israel, then we're going to get on our Instagram pages a whole load of talkbacks saying, how are you going to appear in that apartheid state, etc. And I think this kind of cultural pressure is there, and one feels it, of course, also in the academic world, but is there also in the film industry. And I think that to historicize it, if one goes back to the Arab boycott in the 1950s and 1960s, that was less of a problem in Hollywood. It was a problem for Israel in the economic sphere that we talked about. For Coca-Cola wouldn't come to Israel, and it was well known that that was one of the reasons. And but there weren't enough film revenues in the Arab world to really worry Hollywood. And today, as I suggested, it's on the other way around. The way to pressure Israelis is through culture, is through the academic world, and in that is where the pressure is mostly felt, and it's felt at home, and there it reaches even the Upper Galilee. It's felt at home because it's the Western world from where Israel derives its support and to which it wants to be attached also as a democracy, as shared values. And that has been a success, I think, of the BDS movement. Certainly has been a success.
Well, I think it might be time to see if we have some questions from the audience for our authors.
May I ask a question?
Please.
There are a couple of characters, I will say, in your book, worthy of personality sketches. One was Arnon Milchan, and a person with a foot in two lands and indispensable in each of them. And Haim Saban, whom you liken to Arthur Krim, maybe a latter-day Arthur Krim. I wonder if you could speak to each of them, their role in Israel, their influence in the United States, and their overall importance to the story and the history that you are telling in your interesting book.
I can say a bit about Saban.Maybe Giora could say something about Milchan. I mean, Saban's a really fascinating character, and I think for us, he's bridging Hollywood and Washington D.C. You know, he's got a foot in both camps there. So he's a mover and shaker in diplomacy and politics. So he's got lots of influence in Hollywood itself because of his financial interests there and the cultural influence he has there. But you know, he has his own think tank, or he has his own think tank within Washington, D.C. He's was very close to the Clintons. And that tells us something about our book. I mean, what our book wants to be saying in some ways is, you know, there's been lots written about, let's say, the Israeli influence in Washington, D.C., or the Israeli influence in New York. But what about the Israeli influence in Los Angeles? You know, in particular in the cultural matters. And I think Saban is a really great person through which we can see the influence of Los Angeles and its relationship with Israel.
Arnon Milchan is very, very interesting in terms of his support for Israel, because this is one of the most successful independent producers in Hollywood in the last 3 decades. He has made a long, long list of very successful films. He's won awards for them at the Oscars. But it's interesting to notice, and we make that, and we note that in the book, that unlike Arthur Krim, he didn't produce in all these years of his Hollywood success a film about Israel. And he did start, and our book does discuss his interest in making one film about. He was involved in a project which never came out about Moshe Dayan. First time that Robert De Niro came out to Israel, and Robert De Niro, who was very close to him and became, again, a supporter of Israel, and of course associated with the liberal side of American politics. And Arnold Milchan was involved also with the Masada series, also the TV series. But in his Hollywood heyday, which lasts a long time, he hasn't made films about Israel. What he has done is offered a lot of diplomatic and political support by making his base in Hollywood a place where Israeli foreign ministers and prime ministers can come over and they have an ear there. People there lending an ear to hear what they have to say and how they present things. And certainly this is a very interesting thing. In a way, Michael, when you were mentioning the early years with the big moguls of the 1920s and 1930s, they would offer support off screen, but didn't make any films. Arthur Krim, in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, made films in and about Israel and also political support. I would say he's a very special case. And Arnold Milchan and Chaim Saban, it's political and diplomatic support, but not a lot of filmmaking, or hardly any filmmaking about Israel or making films in Israel to boost the Israeli economy.
Just one other footnote about each of those folks. Arthur Krim, as a Democratic power, is like Saban in that regard, I would think. Mm-hmm. And Arnold Milchan, I don't know how you could talk about him without talking about being an arms dealer. So how about just a little snippet about that? I found that to be a delicious few paragraphs in your description of him.
Giora, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, of course, we researched Hollywood, and all that the information about Arnold Milchan's arm deals comes first of all from himself. He gave a very candid interview at length to Israeli television, something like 8 years ago, and other media writings about him. So this is not something in the research that we did. How he came to his position of success in Hollywood, that of course is the key interest for us, and how he managed to come over from Israel, like many of those Israelis who want to succeed in Hollywood. And we discussed this a little earlier in the conversation, but Israelis in this sense are not different to many people and filmmakers in Britain or in France or in Italy, who coming to Hollywood meant getting a world audience, or from New Zealand, the latest director to win an Oscar, and to get a worldwide audience, and also, of course, the paycheck that comes with it. And I think
bigger budgets.
And bigger budgets to make films. Yeah. In fact, thinking about that, the Israeli film industry, which technologically is very close also in its innovativeness, digital innovativeness, to Israeli high-tech industry. Israel is a small country. It's got now, it's bigger than it used to be, but still 8-9 million people. That's the audience that you have. And a lot of that audience, even if that wouldn't be made also of many ultra-Orthodox who don't watch films, the kind of films are made in Hollywood, there's a limit to the audience that you have. And then once you strike big in Hollywood, then you get global audiences, or at least American audiences. And it's a bit similar, in my opinion, to Israeli high-tech companies who just want to make an exit. So in the film industry, they're directing their attention to Los Angeles, and in the high-tech industry to the Bay Area and Palo Alto. But of course, it's making it internationally, and the key is through California.
Well, so glad that you could be here with us in California, at least via this platform. It's been fantastic. I'm almost not able to realize that it's the middle of the night for both of you guys. Congratulations to you. Speaking of resilience, it's your resilience that I want to celebrate right now.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And let me add my thanks to Michael, to Tony and Giora, because this was really special, interesting. And anybody who hasn't read the book yet really needs to do so. It's a great, great history and with interesting personalities, and has an important story to tell. So thank you everybody for being here. And Tony and Giora, go to sleep already. Thanks a lot.
As Tracy Ullman used to say, go home, go home.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
We've got a weekend ahead.
Good.
Okay, so thanks very much and good night.
Bye-bye. Yeah, thank you.